there is a flow filtering down to earthly consciousness. And that flow starts off as a unified, essential energy and polarizes as it breaks through into material dimensionality and the temporal matrix of considerations of time and space. The goal of the spiritually dynamic individual who is walking the earthly plane is to, through the cadence of their heart, the recognition of their eyes, the flow of their music, of considerations, to broadcast into the circle of influence, a reattaching of polarities back into a unified existence of source, to uncover in their peripherals the essential narrative of benevolence for a greater, more intimate connectivity of all and recognition of all through the matrix of polarities that has been rendered on this plane. To recognize that these polarities are rendered so for a benevolent purpose in order to designate one with the opportunity to manifest a recognition, an expression of action, a continuous flow in music within this portal of extreme freedom. And when I refer to the earthly dimension as a portal of extreme freedom, it does not mean that there aren't people that are oppressed. It merely means that because oppression exists, it renders one with greater freedom in the poignancy of their expression should they choose to resonate the opposite, should they choose to resonate in love and intimacy. For if all of existence was rendered in love and intimacy, and one would concentrate on engaging that flow into existence, that expression would be beautiful but somewhat counterfeit, for they lack contrast and freedom in that choice. And so when we enter into this polarized construct of earthly consciousness, we recognize that we are empowered with great capacity of freedom by the perceived chaos, by the perceived polarities. It's very difficult for many to envision how is it that you have an individual that is very gracious and you have an individual that's very hostile, and the energies of hostility and graciousness, how can they be emanating from a singular source? Similarly, the energy of dominion and the energy of freedom, they seem to be complete opposites, and how can these emanate from a singular unified source? This has perplexed theologians, philosophers, since the beginning. Man first began to contemplate the cosmos and the world that they inhabit. The idea within the perspective of the eye of eternity, when we speak of the eye of eternity, we are focusing on the perspective of source that transcends the fractaling of time into past, present, and future, and the general barriers that produce separations between resonances. And we're focusing from, so to speak, a bird's eye view that is beyond the construct. And from the eye of eternity, all are engaged in a benevolent, progressing narrative to actualized intimacy. And it is very difficult for an individual occupied in earthly dimension, earthly consciousness, to see through the static and recognize the unity in the narrative and the unity in the cooperation of all parties, whether polarized or essentially on the same resonance, in their cooperation in producing the conditions to have an authentic expression of re-embrace and love and intimacy, and a gradual reintegration through a genuine recognition of the higher love of true intimacy. And so one technique to visualize for individuals that are struggling, especially at times when they are confronting divergent streams, being caught in the vortex of divergent streams that are changing the way they respond or the way they engage, and taking them out of their sacred song of truth. A helpful way of understanding this is, rather than seeing the energy of oppression on one side and the energy of freedom on the other side, think of a single dial, like a radio dial. That dial can be turned into the negative or turned into the positive, but it is a single dial. And it is our job to turn the dial to the complementary resonance that is a more intimate progression towards a solution of reunion. But it is not two separate dials. So the dial for freedom innately has within it the gauge for oppression as well, for they are innately linked. The existence of oppression, by definition, integrates the existence of freedom within the inverse. And the existence of freedom is broadcasting and teaching oppression within the reverse. Each is teaching the other through the inverse. And the idea here is for the individual who is in the fractaled, material, polarized matrix of earthly consciousness to begin to interact with all of existence, reattaching it back to its source in unity and oneness. And so rather than when you perceive corruption or hostility, rather than recognize it and rebel against what you witness, simply do not partake in it. You may admonish it, but do not resonate the existence of it as such. Instead, broadcast the beauty and intimacy that is being signaled in the opposite. So if you perceive great dominion or oppression, you can visualize this expression of dominion and oppression or disaster is broadcasting great intimacy, reunion, freedom from the perspective of the opposite. Similarly to a picture, when an individual would take a photograph, the negative would take the image in the reverse, and when you develop the image, it would produce the picture the way the individual perceived it. Similarly, an individual has to continually take photographs of all of existence, and whenever they incur a polarity that is not within the stream of intimacy and love, simply take the picture as a negative and develop it in the inverse. In this way, the dynamically spiritual individual helps through their recognition, the resonance and song of truth broadcast to the light of all, a gradual, more intimate path back into the essential reunion of the oneness of all things. Such is the law of one.